Hello, and welcome to the Leander Class Long Patrol. I know, I'm wearing a Town Class t-shirt, but it still counts. So why are the Leander Class getting a long patrol? Well, it's my research week, and after the live last week, I thought it'd be nicer to give them a long patrol than to give them a lot of shorts. So this will be about 90 minutes, roughly. So the length of a... well, not quite a shortish movie, but a middle-length movie. It will be broken up into parts, though. It will be. And hopefully it'll be enjoyable. Now, before we get into some things, some points I'm going to make. 1. SHP stands for shaft horsepower. Now, I have a little foible when it comes to the shaft horsepower, and it is quite simple, really. I occasionally call it ship horsepower, and the reason I do is because when I was younger and I asked my dad what it meant, he said, well, ships aren't, and horsepower isn't measured the same. It's measured by the power that goes into the shaft, not the power that comes out, because of the way water works and the way ships works. He's explained to a very much younger version of me. And as a dyslexic, therefore, that became ship is shaft, and shaft is ship horsepower. Now, it's supposed to be shaft horsepower, and most of the time I do get it right. But occasionally I slip into my old childhood ways and say ship horsepower. So I do apologize. But this is just a future note for reference. And if I do say it wrong, please feel free to say, Dol, you said ship horsepower. And I'll go, Dol, I did say ship horsepower, but you knew what I meant. So, the 1930s Royal Navy is a very different place. The Royal Navy 1930s is looking to fill a whole load of cruiser roles and to fill a whole load of missions with, at the time, the C, D, and E class cruisers, which, if you look at them, are very different. Okay, yes, they're very similar, and I do present them as designs orientated along and developed as they go through, and I've done a whole series of videos about them, but they are also very different. These differences are seen in their subtleties. For the D class, they are the bigger cruisers. They're sort of heading towards the E's. And how do I put this? The C's are positioned for this role as the Mediterranean ships, as the ships which are going to go around the world, being the extra cruisers, the presence cruisers. The D's are in a way like the first two batches of town cruisers. They are these larger vessels, slightly more powerful vessels, which are trade protection, to an extent, economic warfare assets. And E-class cruisers are, I would say, pure economic warfare assets. That is what they're for. You're building two of them. Having three would have been quite nice, but what other class does the Royal Navy build two of, which is a subclass, if you consider the C, Ds, and E's as one class? Oh, it's HMS Belfast and her sister, HMS Edinburgh. The two supersized towns. And E's are in many ways supersized D's. There is a reason for this. You have a whole, even before World War One, but during World War One and up until the treaties, you have a whole myriad of cruiser types. You have scout, you have protected, you have armored, you have battle. You have all sorts of variations within them in those. You can have first and second class protected, first and second class armored, theoretically, first and second class scout cruiser. You can have all sorts of different vessels. And the Washington Naval Treaty comes in, and suddenly you have heavy and light. And battlecruisers are off being capital ships because you don't have many capital ships now, and battlecruisers count in that. So you go from having basically two types of almost heavy cruiser, possibly, a trade cruiser. So if you consider the armored and battle cruisers your sort of heavy cruisers, the the protected cruiser your sort of trade ship for protecting trade and economic warfare, and then you had your scout cruiser, which was your very small cruiser designed for scouting ahead of the fleet, fast, nimble, these sort of things. You've lost that. You have lost this, theoretically on paper. In reality, you haven't, because in reality, you still have got so many differing needs for cruisers to do, so many differing roles. And this is especially true for the global spanning Navy, the Royal Navy, which is not looking at purely fighting battles. It's looking at fighting wars. And the reality is for the Royal Navy, when faced with the prospect of fighting wars, is you need a lot of different types of cruisers to fill a lot of different type of roles. So that takes us to the Leander class. And I would say, well, I'd be almost tempted to call them a second class protected cruiser, but they're not that. They're a light cruiser. They are a light cruiser because that's what they're defined as in the time. But they are also the first generation light cruiser of the new builds of the 1930s. The Royal Navy has managed to future-proof a lot. They've managed to use those engines quite a bit on various CDs and Es. They have managed to test out their guns and mounts on the Es. Well, particularly HMS Enterprise. They have managed to do all sorts of things to future-proof and make sure that when they are going for the design of a light cruiser, they're going for the best possible design. But by this point, the design studies and design work has been mostly around the heavy cruiser world. It's mostly been about the counties. Why? Because the Royal Navy's needed to build heavy cruisers. Because it can't build battleships. Nelson and Rodney are lovely. Finishing off Hood, wonderful. That isn't much work for the design bureaus. In fact, for the design bureau, you consider what the directors of naval constructors were doing and had been producing in the run-up to World War One, had been doing during World War One. That was nothing. That was like, I don't know. It's the equivalent of telling someone who's been working 60, 70-hour weeks. Oh, yeah. Right then. Been working 70-hour weeks and busting a gut for years, and we only need you for a morning next month. Couple of mornings, maybe. Let's make it a couple of mornings. You have plenty of time off. Not much to do. Yes, they're not easy. Yes, they are quite well designed. Yes, they are quite complicated in their own ways, but they're not a lot. So they concentrate on the counties. They pour themselves into the counties. And this is where John Jordan's book really does come into its own, because Warships After Washington, if there's one thing it does definitely get right, it gets the right love affair with the county class, the cruisers, and the amount of love the Royal Navy pours into them. And there is a reason for this. The Royal Navy isn't going to have enough battleships to have going around. And it needs to have a big presence ship. And there are exercises. There's a whole Imperial cruise with a couple of battle cruisers, Pulse and Hood, I think, from memory. And, or is it Renown and Hood? One of the R's and Hood, and some C-class go round the world, basically. Sorry, D class. When I said C class, I knew it was D class. But in a sort of thinly veiled economic warfare statement, we're here. We're powerful. This is how Britain has power around the world. But the trouble is, you don't want to do that on a yearly basis. It will wear out your battleships and battle cruisers. It will wear them out. To sail them that far, that hard, through that many seas, that many corners, that many places where there isn't much infrastructure to support them, it will just wear your ships out. So you need something you can deploy to the stations. Now, traditionally, Britain had a lot of battleships. If you look at the pre-Dreadnought battleships, they had dozens of them. And so you could afford to have a couple wandering around because you had a whole load of them sitting in reserve, and that was quite a common thing in that period. And it was the same with cruisers. You had a whole load sitting at home in reserve, so you could afford to wear them out. And if you did wear them out, well, you built some new, you activated one from the reserve, and you built some new ones. You couldn't do this under the treaty system. You couldn't do this under the financial system in interwar years. You couldn't do this with the changing government priorities of spending. Remember, this is in many ways the formative years of the welfare state. The interwar period. Building a land fit for heroes, post-First World War, all these things. They are necessary, important expenditures, but they are also expenditures. So, this is what comes about in the 1930s, and I'm going to expand this, so yeah, you won't see me for a few minutes. The Leander Class stats, as ordered-ish, and please do remember that I am... The thing is, the Leander Class changed so much during construction, there are disputes over which particular model is actually ordered. Henderson's predecessor as Third Sea Lord was just as capable at working around things as Henderson was in certain ways. And it especially came true with the Leander Class, but this also might be why the Leander Class end up with the issues they have. So, displacement would be 6,400 tons. Dimensions would be 150 meters, roughly length. Beam of roughly 14 meters. Draft of roughly 5 meters. An Admiralty free drum boilers generating 60,000 shaft horsepower, able to achieve 30 knots or 5,000 nautical miles at 10 knots was roughly what they were aiming for. There is a dispute with the armament as to when 12 0.5-inch machine guns in 3 quadruple mounts exactly comes in. Whether it's at the beginning, whether originally they start off with 1, then 2, then gain a third. We do know that their air defense was significantly upgraded. And armor, 3-inch box around the magazines, 1-inch deck and 1-inch turrets. And according to at least M.J. Whitley in Cruisers of World War II, an international encyclopedia, which I'll show you in a second, they also had a 3.5-inch sides and 3-inch on the sides on the machinery spaces. So they had a sort of bit of a belt. Not much of a belt, but a bit of a belt, an armoured area. It seems to have been mostly an all-or-nothing design, because let's be honest, 1 inch is virtually nothing. Now, the actual design contains that extra 3.5 inches of armour on the sides, but also it displaces around 7,150 tons. So that meant the class gained weight. Let's be honest, they put 750 tons. Now, in a destroyer world, 750 tons would be ginormous. That would be like a 50% increase in weight. That would be a case of, hello, you have gone from being a rhinoceros to an elephant. But in cruiser world, what can I say? It's more like you have gone from a lion to a tiger. And this is me without actually being sure that tigers are actually heavier than lions, but they always seem heavier and more powerful to me than lions in terms of their body shape and more solid. And that is basically what's happened. It's gone from something which is definitely a group ambush predator to something which is possibly a viable solo predator. Because trade protection is what they're for, but they're also going to be used for hoovering up things which get in their way, and that's the case. So, HMS Leander pretty much spent most of her time as part of the New Zealand division, and then became HMNZS Leander. Now, she is named, and this is... I have some big issues with some of the names of this class. And this is part of the... Occasionally, my sarcasm level does leap through about the Leander class, and this is one of the reasons. Hero and Leander, it's a Greek myth. And basically, Leander is a guy who drowns swimming across Hell's Point in a storm to see a priestess called Hera, who was a priestess of Aphrodite, and she used to light a candle. The candle got blown out. There was a storm, and he managed to... Basically, he died. And then she commits suicide as well over his dead body. It's just... I realized that a lot of navies and a lot of people had a real attachment to ancient Greek and to the whole history of all these things. But a guy who drowns is not a good one to name a ship after. I know there have been many ships named after Leander. I know it's not by any means stretch of imagination the first or even the last when it's called it. Let's see. It's actually the 5th of the 6th, and the previous class had been, guess what, a protected cruiser. And this class is arguably a protected cruiser, although they're a light cruiser. And as I've said, I would compare them to the Town class, who I would say classify as first class protected cruisers. The Leanders, I would say, were second class protected cruisers. Arethusa's I'd call scout cruisers, and Didos I'd call scout cruisers, although they're technically AA cruisers. But, you know, that's me if I was putting in those sort of pre-World War I terminologies, and I was looking at the armor fit and weapons fit and what they're really being talked about doing. That's what I'd be talking about. So she spends most of her life in New Zealand. She does have an inordinate effect on history, though. And this is because the official naval historian of World War II, a guy called Captain Stephen Roskell, who writes The Navy at War in 1939 to 1945, and many, many articles about the Royal Navy in World War II, and is really quite a fair historian, although I don't agree with some of the stuff he writes, but I'm another historian. If we all agree with each other, then something weird is in the water. It does mean his ship becomes rather historically prominent. He does like to talk about her and mention her in the books and the articles he writes. So she gets a fair amount of prominence thanks to that. But no, she's a good ship and she has a good career. I've got some examples listed here. The big change they have during World War II is they lose their catapult aircraft. They're one of the first designs to be really built from hull up with the idea of a catapult in mind. I realized the counties get them and various battleships get modified to have them on all these things. But honestly, when you're talking about aviation being built into the glue and fabric of a ship, this is the first ship which is sort of on the smaller end of the scale that actually does get it built in as far as the Ronnet is concerned from the whole way through. The E-Class do get adapted to have them while they're under construction. And there is some talk of things that they were talking about fitting them before they design, during the process of designing. So, they get designed with them. Well, these are designed from the outset with them. There are many changes in their construction as they're designed. And the interesting thing, of course, is Leander is built by Her Majesty's Dockyard, Devonport. So she's built in one of the Admiralty's own dockyards. And that allows them to play around with her far more. This is the advantage of an Admiralty dockyard, and possibly one of the reasons why it's a good thing the Admiralty maybe longer has dockyards, but also a reason why it's bad that the Admiralty no longer has a dockyards. Because the fact is, if it's an Admiralty dockyard, A, the government controls where it is. B, the government invests in it, and is responsible for investment. So all the costs are on the government. But if you've got enough production coming through, it makes sense, removes the profit requirements. But most importantly, it allows you to, with minimal worries, again, about those profit requirements and that company trying to make a profit, go and make changes in the design. That is an advantage of dockyards like that. You're able to change your design. You're able to change your design while it's under production. And two of the class will be built in Devonport and one will be built in Portsmouth. The other two would be Camel Laird and Vickers, which were as close as you can get to almost government-sponsored enterprises in the beginning of the 1930s, and considering the amount of warships they're churning out. But they are good yards. And I find it no real surprise that the ship which lasts longest is the Camel Laird's built one, HMS Achilles, or HMNZS Achilles, as she becomes. So, New Zealand Division. Deployed, therefore, to the Far East. And would operate there. She'd operate in other places quite often as well, but she was deployed to the Far East quite a lot. Again, she's this is the sort of where you would expect a protected cruiser to have ended up in the pre-World War I era. A distant station, deployed there for trade protection and to form part of a commerce warfare response until a major fleet could arrive in the event of war breaking out. It's all very sensible, very simple strategy. It works. Just because they're called light cruisers and heavy cruisers doesn't mean it's different. Again, HMS Achilles, built by Camel Laird's in Birkenhead. So it's extra beautiful in my eyes. I'm not at all biased towards Camel Laird's. Not at all. Of course, famous for Battle of the River Plate, which we'll be talking about in a second. But, well, a couple of minutes probably. But, like Leander, spends most of her life in the Far East. Becomes HMS Dehli. That's the interesting thing. There is an HMS Dehli which serves with the Royal Navy as a D-class cruiser. But it's Achilles, who, of course, and I did it for Leander, so I should do it for Achilles. But we all remember him. He is the person who gets killed during the Trojan War because he has an Achilles heel. That's his one weak spot. Again, you're naming a cruiser which is going to fight after a hero who literally has given his name to something which means the fatal weakness, the Achilles heel. Why? Again, I know there's a classical Greek education going on, but seriously? Now, the 6-inch guns, as you can see, are prominently featured here, and they're a critical part of the component these ships are built around. It's the turret that's been tested on HMS Enterprise. Key thing about this turret is it can be used for anti-aircraft as well. Now, when I did the live, which there should be a link to down below, there was a nice long discussion about the anti-aircraft properties of a 6-inch gun, especially with fuse shells and whether or not it was viable, it could fire fast enough or turn fast enough to be useful for anti-aircraft. Now, what's interesting is this is, of course, conceived when aircraft are slightly slower, but also pre-radar. And I'd argue it's far more useful once you have radar, because you know where the enemy's coming from, so you can point the gun in that rough direction and start putting up some sort of barrage. But the whole point about these guns is they are supposed to be they are built with the idea that you're going to be dealing with torpedo bombers, you're going to be dealing with level bomber attacks. This is what the Air Ministry kept telling the Royal Navy was going to be the principal attacking method. It was only when the Royal Navy was watching, Royal Navy had suspicions about this because the test itself was carrying out, and the fact that they had various aircraft which could do dive bombing of a type. Most of the Hart light bomber derivatives could do a version of dive bombing quite easily. But the information it had available, the best guesses from the experts it was supposed to consult, said was this: these guns could operate, it could be useful against those. They could be. They could orientate themselves in that direction. They could start blasting out. And the thing is, when you're doing a torpedo attack, you need to fly level, you need to fly low, and you need to fly towards the target. If you're doing a high level of bombing attack, it's similar. You're keeping constant to go high and drop the bombs. It's dive bombing where you do either go very, very high and dive down, or you go like that, or you might do some form of skip bombing. There are lots of different options in that scenario. It's very different and more complicated to deal with in those scenarios than it is the torpedo bomber or the high level bomber. But even in those scenarios, especially once you have radar, putting up a barrage with 6-inch shells, if they are AA shells, or even if they manage to sort of give them a proximity warhead, a proximity fuse or something like that, if you can put up, you can make it so that it's more difficult. It makes the pilot have to fly through the flak or not. They have to choose. Or they have to waste fuel and energy to try and get through the thing. Or they might get damaged. One person commented in the comments, and I can't remember who, I think it might have been Calvin Gasbo, using these 6-inch, these big heavy guns for AA is the equivalent of, instead of trying to shoot to take out enemy infantrymen, you're shooting to wound them. Or you're putting down beating fire of machine gun. You may hit them, you may not. That doesn't matter. You're keeping their heads down, and if you wound them, that means there's going to have to be more infantry involved in extracting them. it's going to sap force and morale. It might take something out physically, in which case that's great, but that's not what you're really using it for. You're using it as part of a barrage to keep their heads down. And it works quite well. It's not snazzy in the missile age when we talk about guaranteed kills and all these sort of things, but if you're fighting an actual war, that works out as quite a good idea. Because if you send the enemy back to base and they've dropped their weapons and haven't hit any targets, so they've wasted fuel, ammunition, and pilots' morale. Because remember, when you're going into these scenarios at this high risk and you're doing all the concentration, it wears you down. It saps you emotionally. So you're doing damage to the enemy on all sorts of levels by just stopping them just making their life harder. Cumulative damage. Kind of like when we talk about Force K. So, Achilles and her sister Ajax, the youngest of the Leander class, and who we'll also be talking about naming for shortly, were of course most famously involved in the Battle of the River Plate. Now, the Battle of the River Plate is one of those battles which are rather fun and rather interesting to talk about, because on paper you have an 11-inch armed heavy cruiser with radar, although, and again I should clarify this from the live, I don't treat, because Grass Bay gets the first generation and is the first ship, I think from memory, fitted with the SeaTac radar, which wasn't really good at anti-ship in the first place, was already fairly worn down, and then there's a dispute in the battle as to whether it gets hit by damaged by shell fire. She also, apparently, there are some reports that Grass Bay loses a director to, well, it's often put down as HMS Exeter's 8-inch shells, but some of the accounts are timing difference, so you're not quite sure whether it was HMS Exeter's 8-inch shells or a 6-inch shell. Either of those hitting a rangefinder is probably going to knock it out. I know, again, there is this idea that the 6-inch shells are somehow pea shooters and the 8-inch shells are somehow very powerful, but no, a 112-pound 6-inch shell is going to cause quite a lot of damage to an unarmored section. And to be honest, the Grass Bay's armor is not that massive. And the whole point is the Grass Bay is supposed to be avoiding combat. That's her best survival technique, because if she actually gets into combat with something, she can get damaged. There's nowhere down there for her to repair or be protected. So that's why I find it so funny when people go, oh, he knew he was taking on HMS Exeter, Langsdorff, the captain of Grass Bay. He thought she was accompanied by 2 destroyers. Even if he just thinks it's Exeter and 2 destroyers, that's an 8-inch cruiser and 2 destroyers. That's still several ships with torpedoes. That's several aggressive ships. That still isn't a good scenario for a surface raider. He can't really get away from them because he starts off with a speed of 28 knots when this all thing begins, but that's months ago by this point. He has got a fouled hull. It's, slowing him down. He's had all sorts of wear on his engines, so he can't go full speed. So I think often the idea that he doesn't run because he thinks he sees a cruiser and destroyers is, well, there is a report at one point that he thinks he's seeing a light cruiser and a couple of destroyers. Even then, I'm not sure about the idea of it going to engage. And then it's a heavy cruiser and destroyers, and then he realizes it's 3 cruisers. And well, I think the only reason you engage is if you can't run away, if you're a surface raider. And in that scenario, even if you have got your lovely 11-inch guns, and if your Arado AR-196 was actually working, which his isn't anymore, or you have radar which is in any way, shape, or form reliable and useful, which isn't. I think Langsdorff picks to attack because he can't run away. I think he thinks if he can't run, the thing is to get in quick, try and get some lucky hits, and then pull away. But I don't think he wants to commit suicide by Royal Navy. That might be looking at it from the reading a history backwards rather than forwards, looking at his actions outside Montevideo Harbour. But I don't think he's thinking about suicide, and he's doing this. And as said, I'm sort of skeptical about some of the later statements about what he thought he was engaging. They divided up, yes, like cruisers, like destroyers would, but again, it fits with Royal Navy tactics. We are taking on a solo target. If we manage to split up, even if they are undamaged, if we manage to split up radar targeting at this point, and if we manage to split up the visual rangefinders so they can't both be used to get figures, so they can't be both reporting what the range is, so you can't get an average range, you make the life far more difficult for them to actually get targets. You degrade their ability to target you and accurately fire on you. So that's what they're doing. They're splitting up to do that. The whole thing is really not a nice scenario from the German perspective, but from the British perspective, it could have been a better scenario. There could have been HMS Neptune, which we'll talk about in a bit there, and there could have been HMS Cumberland there. It could have been 5 cruisers to 1 heavy cruiser, in which case I don't think Graf's Bay would have made it to Montevideo, but we'll leave that to one side. Neptune was unfortunately in the wrong place in the Atlantic at the time, and Cumberland was down in self-refit down in the Falkland Islands. One of the great massive advantages the Royal Navy has, still to this day, actually. Now it's more dependent upon Allied ports, but it's still got a fair number of harbours around the world where ships can go and dock in British territory, and they can be self-maintained. Admittedly, not every single one of them has an airfield, which would make things a lot easier, aka Pitcairn Islands. Having some sort of airfield so you could fly stuff out there would probably make things easier if you were planning on using it, but it's in the Pacific, and I doubt anyone in the current Integrated Strategic Defense Review is currently thinking about the Pacific. From that angle, anyway. So, Part 1 of the battle. Part 1 of the battle is when they're at their greatest ranges. As you can see, it gets down a lot closer. A lot closer. It gets down to, at points, if you follow this round, depends on how accurate you think the map is and the drawing is. It comes from the Royal Navy's records, and it does, remember, it is based on plotting and map drawing and hand drawing the maps and notes taken. So, but the ranges at certain points seem to have got down to very, very close spitball ranges as far as Royal Navy cruiser engagements were concerned. We're talking 3,000 yards, maybe slightly more than that, maybe even slightly less than that. And at certain points, they certainly are getting very, very close. And there's a lot of engagement going on. They take a lot of damage, the two Leander class cruisers. But they also inflict a lot of damage. There are things like the desalinization plant, the diesel purification plant, a lot of things which are very critical for the operation of a ship, especially this far away from home for the Grass Bay, which are actually not protected by armor. One of its rangefinders reportedly gets damaged. Lots of its radio masts and a lot of its superstructure is damaged. What remains of its aircraft is set on fire and burnt in place. There are lots of fires started on the deck. There is lots of damage done to places. And when the Uruguayan reports come out from Montevideo, there has been significant damage. And the damage definitely doesn't accord with the idea that the only ship managing to do any damage from the Allied side was the 8-inch HMS Exeter. Which, yes, she got in a lot, and she certainly tried her best, especially when she was down to one turret, still trying to engage and still trying to keep up the fight until very much she was ordered away from the fight. In true Royal Navy tradition, she had to be, as she was limping and still trying to carry on fighting, was basically ordered home. But still, the 6-inch guns of Achilles and Ajax take their toll. They do. They get in close. They are very aggressively handled. They threaten to get into torpedo range on several occasions. And this is the point. Getting into torpedo range, that's when they could really do some damage. The fact they don't manage to torpedo her is a bit of a disappointment. But I can also understand why doing the maneuvers that were required to open up and launch their torpedoes on the Leander class might not have been that viable in this fight. Because the Grass Bay, for all its movements and for all its firing points, and when impacts were seen of that fire, is still trying to maneuver as fast as it can away from the fight. So this is the other thing, because he chooses to engage this fight, which, as I said, I personally wouldn't if I'd been in this position, if I could avoid it. So that's why I believe he couldn't avoid it, because he didn't have the speed. But then he turns round and runs off. Even when Exeter is out the fight, he still keeps going and trying to get away. And I can understand that, but he can't get away from them. They can do 32.5 knots. He can do 28 knots maximum speed. They've been out for a few months. He's been out for a few months. Let's say both groups have dropped off maybe 4 knots from their top speed. Not unexpected in this time period, considering the time that they've been operating out. Now, the British ones have had more regular maintenance and have had facilities to go and do cleaning and all sorts of things, and there are some floating dry docks around. All these things suggest to me that's probably less likely. They've lost 4 knots than the Grass Bay. They're more likely a lot less. But even if they have dropped 4 knots, because they've got a higher starting point, they're down to 28.5 knots. He's down to 24.5 knots, if not 24. He's not going to get away. But we'll discuss more in the next part. That HMS Neptune. Now, Neptune is believe it or not, one of the names I can actually, to an extent, get behind. Because he's the god of the sea. This makes sense. You know? He's also apparently a patron of horse racing, so that means for cruisers he's doubly perfect, as far as I'm concerned. He's a god of the sea and patron of fast-moving animals. Have at it. There is one problem with Neptune. She's ordered on the 2nd March 1931, laid down 24th of September 1931, launched the 31st of January 1933, and commissioned on 23rd of February 1934. She spends most of her time on the South Atlantic station in her life. She has a mixed crew, and I say this in the nicest way, a very mixed crew, in that while she has a large contingent of New Zealanders, they like the Leander Class, she also carries a large contingent of South African personnel. So, yeah. She does race to Uruguay along with other British units after the Battle of Montevideo, but is the wrong side Atlantic because she's been the other side Atlantic. She takes part in the Battle of Calabria and sends the very Napoleonic era signal, "The enemy battle fleet is in sight." Which is all a fun thing. But with her end comes with Force K. Now, Force K is, by the point in the war where she gets lost, has moved. It's kind of interesting because Neptune had actually spent some time attached to Force K in its original 1939 form. She was never officially part of it, but she spent some time operating with it. When it was the Heavy Force which responded to the River Plate. It was based on Renown and Ark Royal. By 1941, it's gone from this anti-surface raiding force to this surface raiding force based on Malta, basically designed by the Royal Navy to stop supplies getting to North Africa. The theory being supplies will reach North Africa, yes, but we will do our damnedest to make sure none of it reaches it by sea. The old expression, my lords, we know the enemy will try to reach England, yes, but by God's willing, they will not reach it by sea, was the Royal Navy's policy on trying to stop some things happening in North Africa. And they have some very successful operations. It starts off with 2 Arethusa class, i.e. things like HMS Penelope here. I like HMS Penelope. She's cute. But again, I do have an issue of her name, but we'll leave that to the Arethusa class videos. Unfortunately, they are so successful that Churchill gets very, very excited and demands that more cruisers and more destroyers being added. And this includes HMS Kandahar and HMS Neptune. The thing is, when you're starting off, you've basically got 2 what are almost scout cruisers and 2 largest J-class destroyers as your force. And I don't want to say this word, but they are at a certain level more expendable than the Leanders. The Leanders are your second-class protected cruisers. Yes, they're not your town class. And no, you're not able to mass-produce them like you could your Arethusa's and do your Didos. Or your heavy destroyers. but they're still quite useful for operations. Chucking them around in night ops in confined waters in the Mediterranean, where they can, as happens, run into a minefield, which no one really knows is in existence because it was literally laid pretty much almost that day, while hunting for a convoy is not. Well, you can do it on one level because you have a lot of cruisers if you're the Royal Navy, and you don't want to lose any of them. Of course you don't. But losing them is a fact of life in war. Saying that, losing a Leander, Neptune was a very capable unit, and if you consider the way her sisters get involved in various shore bombardments and surface actions that take place further in the war, she's not something you'd wanted to lose if you could have avoided it. She might be first gen of the cruiser reset, but she's a useful first gen. HMS Orion. Now, built by Her Majesty's Dockyard, Devonport, on 24th March 1931, laid down 26th September 1931, launched 24th November 1932, commissioned 18th of January 1934. And this is one I have major problems with. You all knew this was coming. Anyone who's watched the lives knew this one was coming. I have big issues with Orion the Hunter being picked as the name of a Royal Navy warship. I have a slight worry over the fact that he has been the name used for 5 built Royal Navy warships, 1 armoured cruiser which was never built, and a French submarine. Orion, there are multiple stories about him, but apparently has non-consensual sex with a young lady, or rape, and is blinded by her father. Recovers his sight and then is killed whilst hunting with Artemis on Crete. The fact that the HMS Orion, this one, does take part in the successful-ish Crete evacuation seems rather appropriate on that ground, but still, yeah. Yes, he's a hunter, and a cruiser is a hunter, but no. And what is interesting is you do find, even at the time, little notes going around, people going, you're getting a bit, this is a bit obsessed with Greek mythology here. You're obsessing over this gentleman. He apparently appears in Homer's epic, and there's all sorts of stories about him. So he might not, I might be damning someone who actually never did that, and that's just a story which has been added on to him. And it's another story or another person with a similar name and all these things. But still, the thing is, Greek mythology is so long ago, you no longer are naming it for the real people. You are naming it for the stories of the stories as retold through the history in stories. So it's kind of a double literature history. Yeah. Thankfully, no current HMS Orion. And I seriously hope there never will be another one. Although there was actually a Leander Class frigate from memory. Yeah. No, there wasn't a Leander Class frigate. So this was the last one. There was a proposal sorry, I'm checking my notes. There was a proposal for another Leander Class frigate to be named Orion, and they stopped it. So thankfully, they got over their obsession with Greeks and Greek mythology. But she's a lovely-looking ship. Despite her name, she's a lovely-looking ship. I do love those guns. They can get up to... She has, of course, 8 6-inch guns, which can go up to 70 degrees. But she also has 4-inch guns, and they get upgraded to double 4-inch guns. They lose their catapults, and they get them replaced by pom-poms and quad pom-poms, and all sorts of things get added in. They're constantly getting their air defense upgraded. That is one good thing about Leander Class. They do tend to be rather like the Arethusa's, very good at having stuff added on. My big problem, of course, with the Didos is they're very good at not having to have stuff taken off them before you can add anything on, because they're so crown full. But both the Leanders and the Arethusa's and the Towns all prove very good at having stuff added on to them. HMS Ajax. Right, so here's the first thing. There is a whole point about whether it's Ajax, as they should be pronounced, because, of course, in ancient Greece, they don't have the J. And I know Drakenfenel, my lovely colleague, has done a lovely 5-minute guide, which has looked into this. So please go and look at that. I'm going with Ajax, which is how it was pronounced by the average British sailor. And also how it is in the movie, The Battle of the River Plate. So Ajax is my policy. Built by Vickers Armstrong, Baron Furness. Ordered the 1st of October 1932. Laid down 7th of February 1933. Launched the 1st of March 1934. Commissioned 12th of April 1935. Ajax is, of course, named for Ajax the Great, who has all sorts of roles in the Homer's Iliad and the epic cycle. He wanders around. He's a cousin of Achilles, and sort of... Really, I'm not sure why he's called Ajax the Great. Also, he basically... He is, to me, famous for recovering Achilles' body. But again, it doesn't seem... It's not someone who I would name a cruiser after. I'm sorry. There is part of me who really like Ajax and Achilles back, because along with a Type 26 named Exeter, it would be really cool to have them for the 90th anniversary, or possibly the 100th anniversary, if they're still around that time, and considering how long it takes the Royal Navy to actually get nuclear ships into service, probably would be anniversary of the Battle of the River Plate, so they could go down that. If we could get the Germans to kindly name a ship the Graf Spee again, that'd be quite helpful. You'd go down there and have some fun, or the... Yeah, I'm sorry, that is a bit cruel, but I would... That is part of me which would like a Type 31s named Ajax Achilles, despite me not liking their names and thinking that naming them ships after them is silly. There is part of me that part of me which loves history and would love the symbology of it, would love that. I'm a complicated creature. So let's get back into the Battle of the River Plate, because the Battle of the River Plate is fun. And I didn't do this earlier, so I'm going to do this now. See you in a second. Right. As you can see, the battle does have a lot of winding turns, and there is a lot of responding of both sides to the movements of the other. Remember, it's their policy to always try and steer towards the fall of shot, because that actually makes it far more complicated for the enemy to have a firing solution. There is also various markings on that particular map, which do look like firing marks and look like things when impacts are noted, etc. I'm not quite sure. The key, I have to admit, when I was reading it in National Archives, is a little bit less than 100% in terms of its explanation of certain things. But still, it's a fairly accurate recollection as far as the Royal Navy officers and could find out, and as far as they could gather from other materials available at the time. And there were other materials available at the time. The interesting thing is it goes on into a chase. And it does really get into being a chase. Now, the fact is, after the battle, and this is one of the things, this is an Uruguayan report, as far as I understand it, which was included in the materials in the British National Archives. And it covers the timings from the battle sort of ending to the battle officially ending, to the graph from to the Von Spey getting into the harbour and then actually eventually sinking. It very nicely tells you where all the big banks are, including Banco Ingles and all the various channels in and out of Montevideo are. But it also illustrates that firing was continuing as they were making their way. The firing didn't stop until they were really quite close into Montevideo. Really quite, it was really very dark, very close inshore, and the British were worried about hitting someone else. And then, of course, it goes into diplomatic battle. And if you want to learn more about diplomatic battle, I do have some videos on the Battle of the River Plate under the title of River Plate 80, which this video is actually also linked into that sort of that particular grouping of videos. And I hope you enjoy it and find it interesting, because it comes so early in the war. I hate to say this is the high point of the Leanders' involvement in World War II, but it really is the point where they get to shine the most. They are light cruisers, second-class protected cruisers. They are these vessels which are never really going to have a leading role. And when Neptune does have a chance to have a leading role with Force K, unfortunately they have the accident. If they hadn't gone into that minefield and the Force K had carried on for a few more months operating from Malta successfully, then that iteration of Force K had managed to do that for a few more months successfully. Who knows what we'd be talking about? Who knows how much damage they'd have wreaked upon the Mediterranean, upon the convoys going into North Africa, and it might well be a historian like me who'd be sitting here going, and this was the high point of the Leanders involved. This was where they really did demonstrate their role as both trade, protection, and prosecution cruisers. But they don't get that X Factor moment. They don't get that bling moment in those battles. Their bling moment comes very early in World War II. It comes involving two of the class. It's in December 1939, and it is the Battle of the River Plate. And rather like the Altmark incident with HMS Cossack, it would make heroes and villains. And it would make something glorious that the Royal Navy could point to. But the thing is, it happens so early in the war, it fades. If you give us an example, 2020 for those who've lived through it, and this video might be being watched in many years' time by people who thankfully, luckily haven't. The events which you think will have defined and been the epitome of importance in January of 2020 are unlikely to be what you look back on and think about in December 2020 or December 2021 when you're talking about 2020. There have been so many big incidents this year. Working out which ones are going to actually survive international psyche is quite difficult. The odds are it won't be the ones from the first part of it. They just usually don't. And that's what happens with the Battle of the River Plate. It's the first part of World War II. And it is a big, big battle for 1939 December. There is Norway to come. There is the Battle of Denmark Straits. There is the Hunt for the Bismarck. There is PQ-17 and all the other convoy battles to come. There are all sorts of things to come. This is a big battle for 1939, for December 1939. And for December 1939, it matters. But it gets sort of forgotten. Oh, goodness gracious me. We might even make it for the 80-minute mark rather than 90-minute mark. So, summary. Trade protection, they did fleet protection. That was the thing. And I would like to point out again, and I'm going to expand it out, this is a lovely, lovely painting. It's in the New Zealand National Archives, and it's painted by Frank Norton in 1941. Oh, no, in 1940. But she, of course, as written up there, she becomes HMNZS Achilles in 1941. And it really is a lovely painting. I love that painting. Someday I hope to visit New Zealand and get to see that painting in real life, because it is gorgeous. Don't forget HMS Antonine of Warren Toots the cruiser. That's based on a Leander Class cruiser. In fact, one interesting thing is there is actually quite a lot of literature based around being on Leander Class cruisers. And I have a theory again for that as well, in that they are prominent enough in history. In fact, mostly thanks probably to HMS Achilles starring as herself in the Battle of the River Plate movie, that they are known, but they are not so well known that you're going to end up with people going, oh, but surely if they'd been involved in this and this and this and this, and trying to historify your fiction. So you can get away with writing fiction. There are some things which are too famous to write fiction. There's always the thing that Douglas Riemann, when he's doing his battlecruiser book, it is an extra renown class HMS Reliant. He doesn't make her another Hood class. Doesn't make her another Admiral class. He makes her another R class battlecruiser, which is an interesting idea in of itself. When you are dealing with when you're writing historical fiction, you want something to be instantly relatable, but not so relatable that people are going to actually be debating the history with you. because then you can't do the things. And Leander class are that perfect mix. Right, so what are their problems? We've talked us through. I don't think they're big enough. I don't think they're well enough armed. All in comparison to what the Town class are. I think they're too big compared to the Arethusa's. And the Arethusa's are proportionally actually better subdivided. So slightly more survivable. But that isn't their fault. They're Generation 1 that resets, and it's only when you start going, these are all light cruisers, and I will compare them all to the light cruiser standard, that they start to look bad. If you mentally work out and divide your light cruisers up between first class protected cruisers, second class protected cruisers, and scout cruisers, they actually fit very nicely in that middle group, because they aren't too much to be the first class, and they aren't too little to be the scouts. So that's my theory anyway. So, yes. Personally, knowing what I do now with hindsight, I'd have been pumping out Town class and Arethusa's the whole time. Because they are your top-of-the-range protected cruiser that can do economic warfare, everything, all those things, and your best scout cruiser. But the Leanders and the Amphion class, who I'll talk about at some point, they're in the middle of the road. And they're the first generation and the 1.5 generation of that build. And you can't actually get rid of them. The point is, without them, you don't get those other classes. So without these, that are built as a sort of evolution of the C, D, and E's of the counties and all that knowledge to try and start generating a light cruiser, which eventually will turn into these two very successful classes of light cruisers, and also eventually produce the Didos, which are a whole nother kettle of fish. We'll talk about at some point. They're good, but you can tell why they come about. They are a middle-of-the-road option. They are good on their side. So, the thing is, you can't treat them on the same standard you would hold a Town class to, because that's your first-class protected cruiser. It is. And you look at the Arethusa and go, well, I'm getting almost that much capability for that much less cost on that much less tonnage. Why am I building you? Well, that's because the Arethusas are cute and effective. But they're not going to have as much presence as that. And honestly, if I want to send a cruiser that's cheap, cheerful, but effective out to do some deterrence and presence missions in peacetime, I need something a bit bigger. Can I get enough Town classes on the tonnage? Probably not. For warfighting, Town class. Or Arethusas if I'm fighting the Mediterranean, or the Norway, because if I'm going into narrow confined waters, I want the smaller ship, which packs a big punch. But that's you looking back and going, I'm designing my fleet. Looking forward, if you do not build the Leanders, you don't get the others. The Leanders are the starting place, and they're a good place to start, because, again, the thing is, you're dealing with designers, and this is another point I want to make. Most of the senior naval constructors, most of the senior naval architects in the Royal Navy industry had started learning their trade pre-First World War. They had grown up in an era where there were second class, first class, even occasionally third class protected cruisers, where there were sometimes some parts of the world, second class armored cruisers. And that might be historians who call them second class armored cruisers than the other people at the time, but they are certainly a bit battle cruisers, scout cruisers, all the different types of cruisers. There's so many different types of cruisers that to them, those distinctions were part of their makeup, part of their training, part of their DNA. So when we're looking back, we are looking back with the World War II treaty designations: light cruiser, heavy cruiser, light cruiser, heavy cruiser. And this can, and the whole way through this long patrol, I've been trying to make the case that evaluates it wrong. That is us reading history backwards and comparing them to these arbitrary things which are written down in the treaties. We need to read history forwards. We need to look at the missions they're being built for. We need to look at when they are built, the context of being they're built, and most importantly, what they are built to do. So, they're middle of the road. And they spend most of their war filling gaps and supporting things. And they do those missions well. They do them well. So yeah, not my favorite cruisers, but that doesn't mean I don't like them, and doesn't mean I don't see their value, and doesn't mean they do not have value. They're an important step on the pathway to what comes next. They're a vital part of World War II, and they have a vital role in the context when you look at it. And when you think like the people who were designing them, developing them, ordering them at the time fought. Because the naval officers who were in charge at this point had grown up pre-World War I and still fought with all those different cruiser designs and their heads and cruiser roles. So did the politicians to an extent. So did the designers. They weren't building a light cruiser. That was just the category it fell under. They were building for that role. And then they wouldn't write it as we are building a second-class protected cruiser. No, we're building a cruiser for trade protection. Well, that's primarily a protected cruiser in pre-World War I. That's what we're looking for. Trade protection, that's protected cruiser. Many, many different definitions. Wrong way. Where else can you find me so I can try and finish this in 80 minutes? That's going to be shock. I was expecting to be 90 minutes, but 80 minutes will be lovely. Hopefully more people will watch it the whole way through. Twitter at AC_Naval History. Patreon AC Naval History, and Global Maritime History. And most importantly, thank you for watching. If you do like, please subscribe and press the little bell down there as well, because I'm told that tells you when I have videos go up. And thank you. Thank you to all the people watching. Thank you to the people who subscribed. And thank you to my patrons who make my book buying habits viable. You've all been great, and I hope you've enjoyed this long patrol. I hope you found it useful and interesting to develop, to analyze things in the long thing. I realize I am, what's his name? I ended up watching it the other day because it just came up and looked so long, and I know I'm concerned. Is it Joe Rogan, who does sometimes 3-hour-long videos? I'm not quite go that far in terms of posting up recorded videos, but my lives sometimes reach there. But I do like the idea of occasionally doing long patrols, and that's why this week, when I'm on my research week, I'm not really supposed to be doing lives, but who knows? I might have done one anyway. I thought I'd post a couple of these. Thank you. Take care. Before I go, another quick look at HMS Penelope. Isn't she cute? Arethusa Class. Scout Cruiser. Thank you. Take care.